My name is Nia Carter, and for 12 years I sat quietly at family gatherings listening to people explain why I would never become anything. Some people are born into families that celebrate their success. I was born into a family that seemed determined to celebrate everyone except me. The latest example was happening inside my parents' Atlanta mansion on a warm Saturday evening. More than 40 guests filled the house. Expensive wine flowed freely. Laughter echoed through the dining room. My younger sister Jasmine was hosting an engagement celebration with her fiancé Trey Sterling, the son of one of Georgia's most respected business families. According to my parents, this engagement was the greatest achievement our family had ever witnessed. You would have thought Jasmine had personally negotiated world peace. Meanwhile, I was carrying serving trays from the kitchen while guests walked past me without remembering my name. None of that surprised me. I learned years ago that expectations are dangerous when your family has already decided who you are. To my parents, Jasmine was the golden child. She graduated from the right schools, wore the right clothes, dated the right men, and said the right things. I was the mistake, the daughter who dropped out of college, the daughter who disappeared for years, the daughter who supposedly wasted every opportunity she was given. At least that was the story everyone believed. Around 7 o'clock, I carried a tray of champagne glasses toward the dining room when I realized I had forgotten my phone near the library. Since nobody seemed interested in helping, I quietly slipped away from the party and headed down the hallway. The library sat near the rear of the house beside a private sitting room. As I approached the door, I heard voices. Normally, I would have kept walking. Then I recognized one of them, Beverly Sterling, Trey's mother, the woman my parents spent the entire evening trying to impress. Her voice carried easily through the partially open doorway. "Let's be honest," she said. "Jasmine is wonderful, but that older daughter worries me." Something about her tone made me stay. Another voice answered. My mother. "We don't discuss Nia much anymore." Laughter followed. Actual laughter. I slowly stepped closer to the doorway. Beverly spoke again. "I heard she never finished college. What does she even do now?" My father answered this time. "Nobody really knows. She claims she's involved in consulting." More laughter. "Consulting?" Beverly said. "That's usually what unemployed people call unemployment." The room erupted again. My hand tightened around the serving tray. For a moment, I considered walking away. Then curiosity kept me rooted in place. I wanted to know what people said when they thought I couldn't hear them. Apparently, the answer was everything. "At least Jasmine understands ambition," Beverly continued. "Trey needs a wife who fits into our world. The business community notices these things." My mother immediately agreed. "We've always worried that Nia would embarrass herself around successful people." That one actually hurt. Not because it was true, because she genuinely believed it. The conversation continued for several minutes. Every sentence revealed another layer of what they thought about me. I wasn't simply unsuccessful. I was a disappointment, an inconvenience, a reminder of expectations that had supposedly gone unmet. Then the discussion shifted. Beverly lowered her voice slightly. "Once the property situation is finalized, none of this will matter anyway." Property situation. The words immediately caught my attention. My father responded carefully. "Sterling assures us everything is moving forward." "Absolutely," Beverly said. "Within a few weeks, the paperwork should be complete." Something about the exchange felt strange. The tone changed. The laughter disappeared. Suddenly, everyone sounded serious, businesslike. Then Beverly said something that made me stop breathing. "Honestly, they're lucky Trey is helping them at all. Most people would have already lost that house." Silence followed. My parents didn't argue. They didn't sound surprised, which meant they already knew exactly what she was talking about. I slowly leaned closer to the door. Every instinct told me I was hearing something important. My mother sighed. "We appreciate everything your family has done," Beverly responded immediately. "Just make sure nobody interferes, especially Nia." My name landed like a hammer. "Nia doesn't know anything," my father said confidently. "Good," Beverly replied. "Let's keep it that way." The conversation moved on, but I barely heard another word. My mind was already racing. The house, paperwork, Trey, Sterling, property situation. Most importantly, the fact that my parents believed I knew nothing. A small smile appeared on my face despite everything I had just heard. because they were right about one thing. I hadn't known what they were planning. Not until tonight. But they were very wrong about something else. They thought I was powerless. They thought I was the least important person in the family. They thought I would continue standing quietly in the background while everyone else controlled the story. Unfortunately for them, I had spent the last 6 months investigating the Sterling family. And the moment Beverly mentioned the house, several pieces of a much larger puzzle suddenly snapped into place. My phone buzzed inside my pocket. I pulled it out and opened a secure messaging application. Then I typed 2 words and hit send. Code red. The response arrived less than 30 seconds later. As I stared at the message appearing on my screen, I realized tonight's engagement party was about to become something very different from what anyone had planned. The message on my screen contained only 4 words. Team already in position. Most people would have ignored the significance of that sentence. Most people attending the engagement party downstairs would have assumed I was exactly who my parents believed I was. A disappointing daughter carrying trays while successful people discussed important matters. That misunderstanding had become one of my greatest advantages. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and stood quietly in the hallway for several seconds, replaying Beverly's words in my head. Property situation, paperwork. They would have already lost that house. The pieces were beginning to fit together. Not perfectly, not yet, but enough to confirm that the Sterling family wasn't simply helping my parents. They were positioning themselves to take something. The problem for them was that the house in question wasn't nearly as vulnerable as they believed. 5 years earlier, my parents came dangerously close to losing everything. My father never knew how serious the situation became because I made sure he never found out. Medical debt, failed investments, and a series of terrible financial decisions pushed them to the edge of foreclosure. While they continued pretending everything was fine, I quietly monitored the situation from a distance. By that point, I had already built the foundation of a business nobody in my family knew existed. I still remember the day I received the call from one of the attorneys managing distressed properties. My parents had less than 3 weeks before losing the house. 3 weeks before strangers would own the place where I grew up. The logical decision would have been to let it happen. My parents had spent years criticizing every choice I made. When I left college, they told everyone I lacked discipline. When I disappeared from Atlanta, they told relatives I couldn't handle responsibility. When I stopped attending family events, they described me as ungrateful. Yet, despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to watch them lose their home. So I intervened. Quietly, legally, permanently. Through a series of trust structures and holding companies, I purchased the debt attached to the property before foreclosure proceedings advanced further. Then I paid off the remaining obligations. The entire process happened without my parents ever learning my involvement. The attorneys signed confidentiality agreements. The ownership structure remained private. Publicly, it appeared as though a financial institution resolved the issue. Privately, I became the reason they still lived there. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so sad. For 5 years, my parents criticized the daughter who saved their home. Every holiday, every birthday, every family gathering. They celebrated Jasmine while living inside a property protected by me. I returned to the party and immediately noticed Beverly standing beside my mother near the grand staircase. The two women were laughing together like lifelong friends. Looking at them now felt different. Earlier, I saw a wealthy family welcoming my sister into their world. Now I saw people hiding something. My mother spotted me first. "Nia," she called. "Where have you been?" I lifted the tray slightly. "Working." Several nearby guests laughed. My mother didn't seem embarrassed. If anything, she looked satisfied. Beverly smiled politely, the kind of smile people use when speaking to someone they consider beneath them. "Your sister could use some help organizing the gift table," she said. Not a request, an instruction. I almost smiled. 6 months ago, comments like that would have annoyed me. Tonight, they felt useful. The more invisible people think you are, the more freely they reveal themselves. I nodded and headed toward the reception area. Jasmine was already there, examining engagement gifts with the excitement of someone who believed life always moved in her favor. The moment she saw me, she pointed toward several unopened boxes. "Can you handle those?" she asked. No greeting. No thank you. Just another assignment. "Sure," I replied. Jasmine barely looked up. That wasn't unusual. My sister spent most of her life assuming I would always be available when she needed something. While organizing the gifts, I listened carefully to conversations happening around me. Sterling's name appeared repeatedly. Investment opportunities, expansion projects, real estate acquisitions. Every topic seemed connected to money. Then I heard Trey speaking with several guests near the bar. The paperwork should be finalized soon, he said confidently. Once that happens, the value increase will surprise everyone. Another guest asked whether the homeowners understood what was happening. Trey laughed. Not completely. More laughter followed. My eyes narrowed immediately. Homeowners. Paperwork. Value increase. The same language Beverly used earlier. Whatever they were planning clearly involved property. More importantly, they seemed very confident nobody understood the full picture. A few minutes later, my phone vibrated again. This time, the message came from one of my analysts. The subject line contained a name I hadn't expected to see. Sterling Holdings. Attached beneath it was a single sentence. You need to see this immediately. As I opened the file and looked at the first page, every remaining doubt disappeared. The Sterling family wasn't helping my parents. They were preparing to steal the house. And if the documents in front of me were accurate, tonight's engagement party was only the beginning. My sister Jasmine had a gift for making people feel small without ever raising her voice. She didn't need insults. She didn't need arguments. She simply treated certain people as though they existed several levels beneath her, and after years of practice, she had become remarkably good at it. 20 minutes after receiving the report about Sterling Holdings, I was standing beside the gift table organizing boxes while Jasmine entertained a group of friends near the center of the ballroom. Every few minutes, she would point toward something that needed to be moved, adjusted, or cleaned. Each instruction was directed at me. None of her friends seemed surprised, neither did my parents. To them, this was normal. Jasmine was the future of the family. I was unpaid labor. The strange thing was that I no longer felt angry about it. Earlier in my life, their treatment would have ruined my evening. Tonight it felt useful. People reveal more when they believe you don't matter. As I arranged another stack of gifts, I watched Trey move through the room shaking hands and accepting congratulations. On the surface, he looked exactly like the successful young executive everyone believed him to be. Expensive watch, tailored suit, perfect smile, confident posture. The kind of man people trusted immediately, the kind of man investors wanted to meet, the kind of man my parents desperately wanted Jasmine to marry. Yet after reviewing the preliminary report from my analyst, I was beginning to suspect that Trey's public image and reality might be very different things. My phone vibrated again. Another secure message appeared. I opened it discreetly behind a stack of gift boxes. Additional files had arrived. Property records, corporate filings, internal debt summaries. I didn't have time to review everything, but one figure immediately caught my attention. Sterling Holdings had significantly more debt than publicly reported. Not enough to trigger panic. Not yet, but enough to explain why they might suddenly become interested in acquiring valuable real estate through questionable methods. Before I could continue reading, Jasmine appeared beside me holding an empty champagne glass. "There you are," she said. "I've been looking for you." I resisted the urge to point out that she hadn't actually looked at all. "What do you need?" I asked. "Can you take care of Bella for a while?" Bella was her designer dog. The animal wore a custom collar that probably cost more than my first apartment. Jasmine handed me the leash before I could answer. "Trey and I need time with our guests." Then she lowered her voice slightly. "Try not to disappear this time." Several people nearby laughed. The joke wasn't particularly funny, but nobody wanted to risk offending the bride-to-be. Jasmine smiled and walked away. I looked down at the dog. The dog looked back at me. At least one of us seemed embarrassed by the situation. As I moved toward a quieter corner of the room, I noticed Trey speaking with my father near the bar. Their conversation appeared friendly at first. Then Trey handed him a folder. My attention sharpened immediately. The folder looked similar to the one Beverly had referenced earlier. My father glanced through several pages while Trey pointed toward specific sections. Neither man noticed me watching from across the room. A minute later, my mother joined them. Then Beverly. Whatever discussion was taking place, it clearly involved all the key players. The timing wasn't accidental. Neither was the paperwork. My phone vibrated once more. This time the message came from the same analyst who sent the code red response. The text contained only one sentence. "We found the acquisition structure." My pulse accelerated. That was exactly what I had been waiting for. I opened the attachment and began reading. The deeper I went, the worse the situation became. Through a series of shell companies and intermediary entities, someone had been building a legal pathway toward controlling my parents' property. The structure was complicated enough to confuse most people. That was the point. On the surface, it looked like financial assistance. Behind the scenes, it functioned as an ownership transfer mechanism. The homeowners would believe they were receiving help. Eventually, they would discover they had signed away control. My eyes returned to Trey. He was still smiling, still charming, still accepting congratulations from guests who believed he was building a bright future with my sister. Suddenly, another memory surfaced. 6 months earlier, one of my analysts flagged unusual activity involving Sterling Holdings. At the time, the information seemed insignificant. A few distressed assets, some aggressive refinancing, nothing unusual. But over the following months, the pattern continued growing. More debt, more pressure, more urgency. The company wasn't expanding because it was strong. It was expanding because it needed cash. Fast. Everything Beverly said earlier now made perfect sense. They weren't helping my parents because they cared. They were targeting the house because they needed it. A loud burst of laughter pulled my attention back to the party. Jasmine had gathered a small audience near the center of the room. Predictably, I became part of the entertainment. "You know what my sister's biggest problem is?" Jasmine asked. Several guests leaned in. "She never thinks big enough." More laughter followed. "Some people are just comfortable staying average." My parents smiled. Beverly smiled. Trey smiled. Nobody defended me. Nobody ever did. The strange part was that I almost felt sorry for them. They were standing a few feet away from information that could completely change their understanding of reality, and they didn't even know it. Jasmine continued talking. "Success isn't complicated. You just have to surround yourself with winners." Her gaze briefly landed on me before returning to her guests. The implication couldn't have been clearer. Another round of laughter followed. I lowered my eyes and pretended not to notice. Meanwhile, my phone delivered one final notification. This one wasn't from an analyst. It came from a senior attorney working with my team. I opened the message and immediately felt my stomach tighten. The lawyer had verified something none of us expected. According to the records, the documents Trey planned to present later that evening were already prepared. Signatures were the only thing missing. My father wasn't being invited into an opportunity. He was being guided into a trap. And unless I stopped it, the first signature could happen before the night was over. My father had always believed paperwork was proof of honesty. If a document looked professional, carried enough legal language, and arrived from someone wearing an expensive suit, he trusted it. That belief had helped him build a respectable career decades earlier. Unfortunately, it also made him vulnerable to people who understood how trust could be manipulated. As I watched him laughing with Trey near the bar, a feeling settled in my stomach that had nothing to do with anger. It was urgency. For the first time all evening, I could see exactly where this was heading. The engagement party wasn't simply a celebration. It was a carefully chosen stage. The Sterling family wanted everyone relaxed, happy, and emotionally invested before presenting whatever documents they planned to introduce later. That wasn't an accident. People make terrible financial decisions when they're surrounded by excitement and social pressure. Trey understood that. Beverly understood that. And judging by the information appearing on my phone, they had been preparing for this moment for months. I stepped outside onto the rear terrace and finally allowed myself to review the complete report. Atlanta's evening air felt cooler than the crowded ballroom behind me. The sounds of music and laughter faded as I opened the encrypted file. The first few pages focused on Sterling Holdings, revenue projections, asset reports, debt obligations. Nothing shocking at first glance. Then I reached the sections my analysts highlighted in red. That's when the real picture emerged. The company wasn't thriving. It was bleeding cash. Multiple projects were operating at losses. Several loans had been restructured within the last 18 months. Two lenders had already reduced their exposure. Most alarming of all, A significant debt payment was approaching within the next quarter. Suddenly, the urgency made perfect sense. Sterling Holdings didn't need another investment opportunity. It needed a rescue. My eyes moved to the next section, the acquisition pathway. That's where things became dangerous. Through a network of shell companies, legal entities, and property management agreements, someone had constructed a process capable of transferring ownership rights while making the transaction appear beneficial to the homeowner. It was clever, extremely clever. Most families would never recognize what was happening until it was too late. They would believe they were signing refinancing documents or partnership agreements. Months later, they would discover they no longer controlled the asset. The more I read, the more one detail kept bothering me. Trey wasn't smart enough to design something this sophisticated on his own. Charming? Yes. Manipulative? Absolutely. But this structure required experienced legal and financial guidance. Someone older was directing the operation, someone who understood exactly how these transactions worked. My phone buzzed again. Another message from my analyst. We traced the architect. Attached beneath the text was a name, Sterling Reynolds, Trey's father. I stared at the screen for several seconds. Of course, the respected businessman, the community leader, the man whose reputation opened doors across the state, the man everyone trusted. Suddenly, everything fit together. Trey wasn't leading the operation. He was the smiling face presenting it. Sterling Reynolds was the one pulling the strings. A memory surfaced immediately. 3 months earlier, one of my investigators mentioned Sterling Reynolds during a routine briefing. At the time, his name appeared connected to several unusually aggressive property acquisitions. Nothing illegal, nothing actionable. Just enough unusual activity to attract attention. I remembered telling my team to keep watching. Apparently they had. And now the results were sitting in my hands. I continued reading. More shell companies appeared, more acquisitions, more distressed homeowners. Some had lost property. Others signed agreements they clearly didn't understand. None of it had generated criminal charges. Yet a pattern existed. A pattern that looked disturbingly familiar. The Sterling family identified vulnerable situations and positioned themselves to benefit from them. Tonight my parents had become the next target. Behind me, the terrace door opened. I quickly locked my phone screen. My mother stepped outside carrying a glass of wine. "There you are," she said. "People are wondering where you've been." I almost laughed. Nobody had spent years wondering where I had been until they needed something. "Just getting some air," I replied. My mother nodded absent-mindedly before looking through the glass doors toward the ballroom. Her expression softened. "Isn't Jasmine wonderful?" There it was again, the comparison. The constant reminder. Even now, standing alone together, she couldn't help herself. "She's happy," I said carefully. "That's what matters." My mother smiled. "Trey is going to take care of her." The confidence in her voice nearly broke my heart, because she truly believed it. She genuinely trusted these people. She genuinely believed the Sterlings represented security, success, and opportunity. She had no idea they were preparing to exploit that trust. "You could learn something from them," she added. The words landed exactly as intended. Not cruel enough to start an argument, just sharp enough to remind me of my place. I nodded politely. Arguing would accomplish nothing. My mother returned to the party a minute later, leaving me alone with my thoughts. As soon as she disappeared, I reopened the report. The final section contained information my team had only verified an hour earlier. I read it once, then again, then a third time. My pulse accelerated with every sentence. The documents Trey planned to present weren't merely dangerous. They had already been customized. Names inserted, property descriptions inserted, transfer language prepared. This wasn't a future possibility anymore. It was happening tonight. Another secure message arrived. This one came from the attorney overseeing my investigation. The wording was simple. "We are ready if you are." I stared at the screen while music drifted from inside the mansion. Around me, guests celebrated an engagement. Toasts were being prepared. Photographs were being taken. Everyone believed the evening was moving toward a happy ending. They couldn't have been more wrong. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and looked through the glass doors toward Trey. He was standing beside my father again, smiling, laughing, waiting. For the first time all evening, I understood exactly what his next move would be. And judging by the folder now sitting in his hands, that move was coming much sooner than he realized. My sister had always loved being the center of attention. As the evening progressed, the engagement party slowly transformed into exactly what Jasmine wanted, a celebration focused entirely on her future. Guests gathered around her near the center of the ballroom while photographers moved from group to group capturing carefully staged moments. Every smile looked perfect. Every laugh sounded effortless. Every conversation reinforced the same message. Jasmine was winning at life. At least that was the story everyone wanted to believe. I stood near the rear of the room watching the performance unfold while waitstaff circulated with trays of champagne and appetizers. The irony wasn't lost on me. Most of the guests assumed I was helping organize the event. Some probably believed I worked for the catering company. Nobody questioned why the bride's older sister spent more time carrying boxes than celebrating. That was the role my family assigned me years ago. Invisible, useful, forgettable. Across the room, Trey raised his glass and delivered a short toast. He thanked everyone for attending. He praised family values. He spoke about loyalty, trust, and building a future together. The guests loved it. Several even applauded. I almost admired how naturally the lies came to him. While he talked about trust, he was preparing documents designed to steal a family's home. While he talked about loyalty, his father was orchestrating a scheme built on deception. The contrast would have been amusing if it weren't so dangerous. A few minutes later, Jasmine spotted me standing alone and immediately decided to make me part of the entertainment. Nia, she called loudly enough for half the room to hear. Conversations paused, heads turned. I slowly looked up. Can you come here for a second? There was no reason to refuse. I walked toward the group gathered around her. Jasmine smiled brightly. The smile looked warm to strangers. I recognized it as something else entirely. Everyone keeps asking about my sister, she announced. Nobody had actually been asking. I was just telling them how independent you've always been. Several guests smiled politely. Then Jasmine continued. Of course, sometimes independence means refusing help even when you need it. A few people laughed. The setup was obvious. She wasn't introducing me. She was positioning me as the family cautionary tale. Remember when you left college? She asked. More guests turned toward me. My parents immediately became interested in the conversation. Trey remained silent beside her, watching, measuring reactions. That was a long time ago, I said calmly. It was definitely memorable, Jasmine replied. More laughter followed. Mom thought you would come back after a semester. Another laugh. Then after a year. More laughter. Then eventually we just stopped asking. The crowd found the story entertaining. Why wouldn't they? To them it sounded like harmless family teasing. None of them understood that every joke carried years of judgment beneath it. My mother smiled into her wine glass. My father didn't interrupt. Neither seemed uncomfortable. In fact, they looked pleased. Jasmine wasn't embarrassing the family. She was reminding everyone which daughter deserved admiration. Fortunately, things worked out for me, Jasmine continued. She reached for Trey's hand. Sometimes the best decisions involve surrounding yourself with successful people. The implication was obvious. The room responded exactly as she expected. Several guests nodded approvingly. Others congratulated the couple again. The spotlight returned to where Jasmine wanted it. I should have felt humiliated. Instead, I found myself studying the people around me. Beverly looked satisfied. Trey looked confident. My parents looked proud. None of them realized how close they were standing to disaster. One of the guests asked what I did for a living. Before I could answer, Jasmine spoke first. Consulting. The word dripped with amusement. At least I think that's what she calls it. More laughter followed. I smiled politely. Correcting her would have been pointless. The truth worked best when delivered at the right moment. And tonight wasn't there yet. A waiter approached with fresh champagne. Jasmine accepted a glass and immediately launched into another story. This one involved a family vacation from years earlier. Predictably, she cast herself as responsible and me as reckless. The details barely mattered. The audience laughed anyway. People enjoy stories that confirm what they already believe. Then Beverly decided to join the performance. Every family has one child who understands opportunity and one who doesn't, she said casually. The comment generated immediate agreement from several guests. Beverly glanced directly at me. Thankfully, Jasmine understands how important relationships can be. There it was. The message beneath the message. Jasmine chose correctly. Nia did not. Successful people choose winners. Unsuccessful people create excuses. The entire room seemed eager to accept that version of reality. I looked toward my father. For a brief moment, I wondered whether he would finally say something. Defend me. Challenge the narrative. Do anything. He simply smiled and raised his glass toward Trey. The disappointment wasn't new. Somehow that made it worse. Then another notification appeared on my phone. I glanced down discreetly. The attorney had sent an update. Meeting confirmed. Documents arriving in 22 minutes. My pulse quickened instantly. The timeline was accelerating. Whatever Trey planned to do tonight, he was preparing to do it soon. I slipped the phone away and looked across the room. Almost immediately, I noticed movement near the entrance. A man wearing a dark suit had arrived carrying a leather portfolio case. Trey spotted him within seconds. So did Sterling Reynolds, who had quietly entered the party 15 minutes earlier without attracting much attention. The two men exchanged a glance. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to confirm recognition. Then Sterling guided the newcomer toward a private seating area near the library. My attention sharpened immediately. Nobody else seemed to notice. Why would they? Everyone remained focused on the engagement celebration. But I recognized preparation when I saw it. The documents were here. The trap was almost ready. And as Jasmine continued entertaining guests with stories about my failures, she had no idea that before the night ended, the entire room would learn exactly who had been lying to them all along. The moment I saw the leather portfolio in the stranger's hands, I knew the timetable had changed. Whatever Trey and his family planned to accomplish tonight was no longer a possibility waiting in the future. It was becoming an immediate threat. The problem was that nobody else in the ballroom recognized the danger. Guests continued laughing. Music continued playing. Waiters continued moving between tables carrying champagne. To everyone around me, the evening looked perfect. Meanwhile, a financial trap was quietly moving into position less than 30 feet away. Trey greeted the man carrying the portfolio with the enthusiasm of someone welcoming an old friend. Sterling Reynolds joined them seconds later. The three men exchanged handshakes before moving toward a private seating area near the library. My father watched them with visible admiration. That worried me more than anything. The Sterlings didn't need to force my parents into anything. They only needed to convince them that the offer came from people they could trust. Unfortunately, trust was exactly what my parents wanted to give them. Across the room, Jasmine suddenly raised her champagne glass against a crystal centerpiece. The soft ringing sound immediately captured everyone's attention. "Can I have a moment?" she asked with a bright smile. Guests slowly gathered around. Conversation stopped. Cameras turned toward her. The performance was beginning again. Jasmine stepped forward and wrapped one arm around Trey. "First, I want to thank everyone for celebrating with us tonight." Applause followed. She smiled as though she were accepting an award. "This has been the happiest year of my life." More applause. Then came the part I should have expected. "And I want to thank my family for always supporting me." Her eyes moved across the crowd before settling on me. A small smile appeared. I recognized it immediately. Trouble was coming. "Well," she continued, "most of my family." Laughter rippled through the room. My parents laughed too. Jasmine shook her head dramatically. "Let's be honest. Nia has never exactly been excited about my success." More laughter followed. Several guests turned toward me. Some looked curious. Others looked uncomfortable. Nobody looked surprised. Jasmine had spent years building a narrative where she was the hardworking achiever and I was the bitter older sister. The story had become so familiar that most people accepted it without question. "I remember when Trey and I started dating," Jasmine continued. "Nia told me relationships built on money never work. That was a lie. I never said anything remotely close to it. But Jasmine delivered it confidently enough that nobody questioned her version of events. I think she just couldn't imagine what a healthy relationship looks like." The room erupted again. Even Beverly laughed loudly at that one. Trey wrapped an arm around Jasmine and smiled for the audience. Together they looked like the perfect couple. The image was carefully crafted. The reality hiding underneath was something very different. I remained silent. That only encouraged Jasmine further. She mistook patience for weakness. Most people do. Honestly, she continued, I've always felt sorry for my sister. The room grew quieter. Jasmine knew exactly how to control an audience. Some people spend their entire lives running away from opportunities because they're afraid they'll fail. She paused dramatically. Eventually, failure becomes comfortable. A few guests nodded. Others avoided eye contact. My mother looked embarrassed for me. Not because Jasmine was humiliating me, because she believed Jasmine was telling the truth. That realization hurt more than I wanted to admit. Then Beverly decided to join the attack. Success requires courage, she announced from across the room. Not everyone is willing to do what's necessary. The comment sounded harmless. It wasn't. Every person listening understood who she was talking about. My father raised his glass toward Trey. That's why we're grateful Jasmine found someone who understands ambition. More applause followed. I stood quietly while the people closest to me celebrated my supposed failures in front of an audience. Years ago, the humiliation would have devastated me. Tonight it served a different purpose. Every insult strengthened my resolve. Every lie reminded me why I could no longer protect them from the consequences of their own choices. Jasmine wasn't finished. She stepped away from Trey and looked directly at me. Actually, Nia, could you do one more thing? The tone sounded sweet enough to fool strangers. I already knew better. What? I asked. Some of the guests need fresh drinks. The ballroom became silent. Several people looked shocked. Others waited to see what would happen. Jasmine was asking her older sister to serve drinks during her engagement party in front of dozens of guests. She knew exactly how humiliating that was. More importantly, she wanted everyone else to know it too. Trey didn't stop her. Beverly didn't stop her. My parents didn't stop her. That told me everything. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Jasmine smiled again. Unless you're busy. The challenge hung in the air. She expected me to react emotionally. She wanted an argument. She wanted proof that I was jealous and unstable. Instead, I smiled. Of course. Relief flashed across her face. She thought she had won. The room relaxed. Conversations resumed. Music returned. The performance continued. While guests celebrated Jasmine's victory, I quietly moved toward the bar. Halfway there, my phone vibrated. A new message appeared from the attorney overseeing the investigation. The subject line alone made my pulse jump. They're bringing the documents out now. I slowly lifted my eyes toward the private seating area. Trey was already reaching for the portfolio. Sterling Reynolds was speaking with my father, and for the first time all evening, a stack of signature pages became visible on the table between them. The trap had officially begun. The moment I saw the signature pages on the table, every insult Jasmine had thrown at me faded into the background. The humiliation was no longer the center of the evening. The real attack had begun. Sterling Reynolds stood beside my father with one hand resting on the leather portfolio, speaking in that smooth, polished voice men use when they have practiced deception for decades. Trey stood slightly behind him, smiling like a loyal son watching his father deliver a blessing. Beverly sat near my mother, her expression perfectly composed again, as though she had not spent the last hour quietly looking down on everyone in the room. Jasmine remained near the center of the ballroom, basking in attention, completely unaware that the future she thought she had secured was being built on a trap. I reached the bar, picked up an empty tray, and pretended to arrange champagne glasses while my eyes stayed locked on the private seating area. My father leaned closer to the documents. My mother adjusted her necklace nervously. Sterling smiled wider. He knew exactly how to play them. He did not pressure them with force. He used desire. He used insecurity. He used the desperate hunger my parents had spent years hiding beneath expensive furniture and rehearsed smiles. From where I stood, I could not hear every word, but I could read the body language clearly. Sterling was presenting the paperwork as an opportunity. My father was pretending to understand it. My mother was pretending not to be frightened by it. Trey was pretending to be family. That last part disgusted me most. A few minutes later, Beverly walked toward me with her empty glass held out between two fingers. She did not say, please. She did not even look at my face. Refill this, she said. The command was quiet, but several nearby guests heard it. I took the glass without reacting. Beverly smiled faintly. You know, Nia, Service work suits you. Some people find their level eventually. The words landed exactly where she intended, but I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing pain. I filled her glass slowly and handed it back. Careful, I said softly. Expensive wine stains. Beverly's smile tightened. For a second I thought she might respond. Instead, she turned and walked away, too arrogant to realize that her insult had just pushed me one step closer to ending the entire performance. I returned my attention to the table. Sterling had opened the folder now. My father's reading glasses were on. That meant the documents were no longer being introduced. They were being reviewed. I moved closer under the excuse of collecting empty plates. The nearer I got, the clearer Sterling's voice became. "This is a standard private equity bridge structure," he was saying. "Nothing complicated. Your property simply serves as temporary collateral while the investment vehicle matures." My mother's eyes widened at the words investment vehicle. She had no idea what they meant. Sterling continued before confusion could become hesitation. "Families like ours understand leverage. Wealth is not built by holding assets emotionally. Wealth is built by using assets intelligently." My father nodded immediately, desperate to look sophisticated. "Of course," he said. "That's what I've always believed." I nearly laughed. My father had never believed that in his life. He believed whatever powerful people told him when they made him feel included. Sterling slid the first page forward. "This signature simply authorizes preliminary participation." My phone vibrated in my pocket. I glanced down. A new message from my attorney appeared. Language confirmed. "It is a disguised transfer clause. Do not let him sign." I lifted my eyes just as my father picked up a pen. For one heartbeat, the room seemed to slow around me. Jasmine was laughing near the ballroom entrance. Trey was watching my father with hungry anticipation. Beverly was pretending to sip wine while staring directly at the documents. My mother clasped her hands together like she was watching the family finally rise into the world she always believed she deserved. And my father, the man who had called me useless less than an hour earlier, was about to sign away a house he did not even own. I moved before anyone could stop me. Crossing the private seating area in 3 fast steps, I reached across the table and placed my hand directly over the signature line before the pen touched paper. The silence that followed was instant. My father looked up in shock. Sterling's smile vanished. Trey stepped forward. "What do you think you're doing?" he snapped. I kept my palm on the document, stopping a mistake. My father's face flushed with anger. "Nia, move your hand." I looked at him calmly. "No." The word was simple, but it struck the room harder than a shout. My mother gasped as though I had slapped someone. Jasmine hurried over, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. "Are you serious right now?" she hissed. "You are embarrassing us." I did not look at her. My eyes remained on Sterling. "Explain page 14. Sterling's expression changed so quickly that most people missed it. I didn't. A flicker of irritation, then calculation, then another polished smile. "There is no need for theatrics," he said. "Your father and I are discussing a private family investment. Then, page 14 should be easy to explain." I slid the folder toward myself and opened it exactly where my attorney had directed me. "Because this language does not describe temporary collateral, it describes irrevocable title transfer." The words hung heavily over the table. My father blinked. My mother looked confused. Jasmine looked furious. Trey looked dangerous. Sterling's jaw tightened. "You clearly don't understand commercial instruments," he said. "That is standard protective language." "No," I replied. "Protective language limits risk. This transfers control." A few guests nearby stopped talking. The private conversation was no longer private. Sterling noticed the growing attention and lowered his voice. "Young lady, you are out of your depth." I smiled slightly. "People keep telling me that tonight." Trey moved closer, invading my space. "Give my father the folder." His voice carried just enough threat to reveal who he really was beneath the tailored suit. "Now." I turned my head slowly and looked at him. "Or what?" His nostrils flared. For the first time, the perfect fiancé mask cracked. "Or I will have security remove you." Jasmine grabbed his arm dramatically. "Trey, don't. She's doing this because she's jealous." Then she turned toward the gathering guests. tears already forming with impressive speed. She can't stand that I'm happy. My mother immediately moved to comfort her. My father pushed his chair back and stood. Enough, Nia. His voice thundered across the room. You have spent your entire life resenting this family because you failed to become anything. I will not allow you to destroy Jasmine's future because you are bitter. There it was, public, loud, final. Several guests looked away. Others stared openly. My father's words should have hurt, but something inside me had already gone quiet. He was not defending the truth. He was defending a fantasy. Sterling stepped in smoothly, sensing advantage. David, I completely understand how painful this must be. Every family has someone who struggles when others rise. My father nodded, breathing heavily. Beverly added from behind him. Sometimes the kindest thing is to stop enabling failure. My mother whispered my name with embarrassment, not concern. Jasmine sobbed louder. Trey kept glaring at me. The entire room had arranged itself exactly as expected. Them on one side, me on the other. For a moment, I let them have the scene. I let my father call me bitter. I let Jasmine cry. I let Beverly look superior. I let Sterling pretend he was the reasonable adult saving everyone from my instability. Then I looked down at the contract again and felt absolute clarity settle over me. If you want to sign this, David, I said, deliberately using my father's first name, then you should at least understand what you're signing. His eyes widened at the disrespect. Do not call me David. Then stop behaving like a stranger trying to steal from me. The room went silent. Completely silent. My father stared at me like he had misheard. Steal from you? I lifted the contract. This document uses the house as collateral. This house. The one you're standing in. The one you keep calling yours. Sterling stiffened. Beverly stopped sipping. Trey's face changed. My mother looked between all of us, suddenly afraid. My father laughed once, sharp and humorless. This is my house. I held his gaze. No, it isn't. The shock that moved through the room was almost physical. Jasmine stopped crying. My mother whispered, Nia, what are you talking about? Sterling's eyes narrowed because he was beginning to understand that I knew far more than I should. I did not explain everything yet. Not there. Not with the whole room still standing in the glow of his performance. The truth deserved a bigger stage. Slowly, I closed the folder and stepped away from the table. You all want to talk about ownership, wealth, and legacy? I asked. Fine. Let's talk about it where everyone can see. Then I turned toward the living room, where the massive wall-mounted screen waited in full view of every guest. Behind me, footsteps immediately followed. Angry footsteps. Nervous footsteps. Frightened footsteps. The entire party moved with me, not because they understood what was happening, but because they could feel the old version of the night ending. And as I reached into my bag for the tablet that would expose everything, Sterling Reynolds finally stopped smiling. For several seconds after I said the house did not belong to my father, nobody moved. The silence felt so heavy that even the music coming from the ballroom seemed to disappear. Every face in the room reflected a different emotion. Confusion, anger, curiosity, disbelief. My father looked at me as though I had completely lost my mind. My mother looked frightened. Jasmine looked offended. Trey looked furious. Sterling Reynolds looked something far more dangerous. Concerned. Not panic. Not fear. Concern. The expression lasted only a moment before he forced another smile onto his face, but I had already seen it. For the first time all evening, the man who controlled every conversation was no longer completely certain of the outcome. That alone told me I was closer to the truth than he wanted anyone to realize. This has gone far enough, my father said. His voice echoed through the room. You're embarrassing yourself. Several guests nodded. Others simply watched. Nobody knew who to believe. Not yet. I slowly walked toward the large display screen mounted on the far wall of the living room. The crowd followed naturally. Human beings are drawn to conflict, especially when it involves money, power, and family secrets. Within seconds, almost every guest from the engagement party had gathered around the room. The celebration was forgotten. The speeches were forgotten. Even Jasmine's engagement seemed unimportant now. Everyone wanted answers. Behind me, I heard Trey moving quickly through the crowd. Nia, Stop this nonsense, he snapped. You're making a fool of yourself. I almost smiled. People usually resort to insults when facts stop working. I reached the display screen and connected my tablet. The monitor flickered once before activating. My father folded his arms. Jasmine rolled her eyes dramatically. Beverly whispered something into my mother's ear. Sterling remained silent. That interested me more than anything. Smart people know when talking creates risk. The screen illuminated and displayed a simple property record. Nothing dramatic. Just an official county database entry. The room remained quiet. What is this? My father demanded. The property record for this house, I answered. The same house you've been discussing all evening. He shook his head impatiently. I know what house it is. Then maybe you should know who actually owns it. The room became silent again. I enlarged the ownership section. Several guests stepped closer. My mother squinted at the screen. Jasmine frowned. Trey immediately looked toward Sterling. That reaction didn't escape me. Neither did Sterling's sudden loss of confidence. That's impossible, my father said. There must be a mistake. I zoomed in further. The ownership structure appeared clearly now. The property was controlled through a trust arrangement, not by my father, not by my mother, not by anyone currently standing in the room. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Confusion rapidly replaced certainty. My father stared at the screen as though reality itself had betrayed him. I've lived here for 30 years, he said. That doesn't make you the owner. The words hit harder than I expected. Not because they were cruel, because they were true. My mother slowly sat down. For the first time all evening, she looked genuinely worried. Trey stepped forward. This proves nothing. There it was, the first crack. Earlier he had acted confident. Now he sounded defensive. Actually, I replied, it proves quite a lot. I opened another document, then another, then another. Every file connected to the same conclusion: ownership, debt restructuring, trust administration, property protection. Piece by piece, the story emerged. 5 years earlier, the house had been weeks away from foreclosure. Several guests gasped. My father's face drained of color. My mother immediately looked toward him. What is she talking about? She whispered. He couldn't answer, because he remembered the missed payments, the mounting debt, the financial problems they spent years pretending never happened. The room suddenly felt much smaller. The bank was preparing to take the house, I continued. The only reason that didn't happen is because someone stepped in. My father shook his head violently. No, the lender worked something out. I opened another file. No, the lender sold the debt. More silence followed. The crowd was completely invested now. Nobody wanted to leave. Nobody wanted to miss what came next. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving. Jasmine looked increasingly uncomfortable. She didn't understand the documents, but she understood one thing clearly. The attention had shifted away from her. For the first time in her life, she wasn't controlling the room. Beverly stepped forward. What exactly are you trying to prove? She asked sharply. I looked directly at her. That the people asking my parents to risk this property don't even understand who controls it. The statement landed perfectly. Several guests immediately looked toward Sterling. Others looked toward Trey. Questions were beginning to form. Dangerous questions. Questions they never expected to ask tonight. Sterling finally spoke. Ownership structures can be complicated. His tone remained calm, but I noticed the tension beneath it. Exactly, I said. Which is why nobody should be signing documents they don't understand. My father looked from me to Sterling and back again. For the first time all evening, uncertainty appeared in his eyes. That uncertainty mattered. It meant the blind trust was weakening. The manipulation was losing strength. Trey noticed it too. This is ridiculous, he said. You're creating confusion where none exists. Another mistake. Because confusion only exists when facts don't support your story. Several guests exchanged looks. One investor who had been quietly observing from the back finally spoke. Actually, I'd like to understand this ownership issue before any paperwork is discussed. The room instantly shifted. That single sentence changed everything. The conversation was no longer between family members. Outside eyes were now examining the situation. Neutral eyes. Professional eyes. The kind Sterling feared most. I glanced down at my tablet as another secure message arrived from my legal team. The update was brief, but it made my pulse jump. The final verification had arrived. The document I needed was now confirmed. I slowly looked back at the crowd, then at my parents, then at Sterling Reynolds, because the next file wasn't going to reveal who controlled the house. It was going to reveal who saved it. And once that truth appeared on the screen, nothing inside the room would ever be the same again. The room remained completely silent after I mentioned the person who saved the house. Every guest seemed to understand that the answer mattered. Until now, the conversation had focused on ownership structures, trust arrangements, and legal documents. Those topics were important, but they still felt distant to most people. Saving a family home was different. That was personal. That was emotional. My mother stared at the screen with growing confusion while my father looked increasingly uncomfortable. Deep down, he remembered those months better than anyone. He remembered the unpaid bills. He remembered the collection notices arriving in the mailbox. He remembered lying awake at night pretending everything would somehow work itself out. What he didn't know was how close disaster had actually come. I opened another file and projected it onto the screen. The document appeared simple enough at first glance. A debt acquisition agreement dated 5 years earlier. Several guests leaned forward. Others pulled out reading glasses. The crowd was no longer watching family drama. They were watching a mystery unfold. 5 years ago, I said, the lender holding the mortgage decided to sell the debt. My father shook his head immediately. No, that's not possible. I enlarged the document. The lender's name appeared clearly. So did the sale date. So did the account reference number. Every detail matched official records. My father's face slowly drained of color. He recognized it, not because he had seen the agreement before, but because he remembered the period it came from. The timing aligned perfectly with the worst financial crisis of his life. When the debt was sold, I continued, the new holder gained control of the foreclosure process. My mother's hand moved to her mouth. She was beginning to understand where this was going. Jasmine looked from one parent to the other, searching for reassurance that never came. Even Trey had stopped interrupting. The confidence he carried earlier was fading fast. Facts have a way of doing that. I opened another page. This one contained foreclosure preparation notices. Several guests gasped quietly. The dates were only weeks apart. The timeline was devastatingly clear. The house had less than 21 days left before foreclosure proceedings moved forward. The silence that followed felt almost painful. My mother sat down heavily. 21 days? She whispered. My father couldn't answer. He simply stared at the screen. The room no longer felt like an engagement party. It felt like a courtroom. Every document added another layer of truth. Every fact removed another layer of illusion. Beverly finally stepped forward. What exactly is the point of this? She asked sharply. Her voice carried irritation now, not confidence. Irritation. The difference mattered. Confident people ask questions because they want answers. Irritated people ask questions because they want the conversation to stop. I looked directly at her. The point is simple. Someone stepped in and prevented that foreclosure. Beverly folded her arms. Then thanked them. Several guests shifted awkwardly. Even they could hear the bitterness in her tone. She still believed this conversation would somehow end in her favor. Sterling remained silent beside her. That worried me less than before. Earlier, his silence felt strategic. Now it felt cautious. I clicked another file open. A trust administration record appeared on the screen. Then another. Then another. The legal trail stretched across multiple entities and several years, complex enough to remain invisible to outsiders, clear enough for professionals to follow. The investor who had spoken earlier stepped closer. His expression changed almost immediately. Unlike most people in the room, he actually understood what he was seeing. These entities are connected, he said quietly. I nodded. They are. Sterling shifted his weight slightly. The movement lasted less than a second. Most people missed it. I didn't. He was beginning to realize where this was heading. My father looked toward me. For the first time all evening, his anger had disappeared. In its place sat confusion, genuine confusion. Who bought the debt? He asked. The question echoed through the room. Everyone wanted the answer. Jasmine, Trey, Beverly, Sterling, the guests, my mother, everyone. I held the silence for several seconds, not for drama, because I wanted them to feel the weight of the moment. For years, they had built an entire narrative around my life. They decided who succeeded. They decided who failed. They decided who deserved respect. They decided who mattered. Now, reality was preparing to challenge every assumption they had ever made. The debt wasn't purchased by a bank, I said calmly. It wasn't purchased by an investment group either. My mother's eyes never left my face. My father looked as though he had forgotten how to breathe. Across the room, Jasmine shook her head slightly, already sensing an answer she didn't want to hear. I opened the final page. The acquisition authority appeared at the bottom. Not my name. Not directly. The structure was more sophisticated than that. Trust ownership, holding entities, asset protection vehicles. Yet the chain led to one unavoidable conclusion. The investor near the front reached it first. His eyes widened. Then he looked at me. You bought it. The words landed like an explosion. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. My mother's mouth opened slightly. My father stared at me as though he had never seen me before. Jasmine actually laughed once, a short, nervous sound. That's ridiculous. Nobody joined her. The room was too shocked. Beverly looked genuinely confused for the first time all evening. Trey immediately turned towards Sterling, looking for help, looking for direction, looking for someone to explain how the situation had spun so far out of control. Sterling gave him nothing. I looked at my parents. 5 years ago, when the foreclosure process started, I bought the debt. My mother blinked repeatedly. Tears began forming in her eyes. My father slowly lowered himself into a chair. The strength seemed to leave his legs. No, he whispered. That's impossible. I almost felt sorry for him. Not because he had suffered, because the truth directly contradicted everything he believed about me. If I had been the failure he described for 12 years, none of this could have happened. Yet the documents sitting on the screen didn't care about opinions. Facts rarely do. The lender sold the debt, I said. I purchased it. I paid off the obligations. I protected the property. I kept the foreclosure from moving forward. Nobody in the room knew what to say. Years of assumptions were collapsing in real time. My mother started crying softly. Jasmine looked stunned. Trey looked worried. Beverly looked angry. Sterling looked calculating. The reactions were completely different, but they shared one thing in common. None of them had expected this. The problem for them was that this wasn't even the biggest secret in the room, not even close. Because while everyone struggled to process how I saved the house, another truth remained hidden behind the next file waiting on my tablet, a truth capable of destroying everything the Sterling family had built their plan around. And judging by the way Sterling Reynolds was suddenly watching me, he was beginning to suspect exactly what that truth might be. For several long seconds after I revealed that I had purchased the debt and saved the house, nobody spoke. The silence felt completely different from the earlier moments of shock. This wasn't confusion anymore. This was the sound of people rebuilding reality inside their heads. My parents had spent years believing I was irresponsible. Jasmine spent years presenting herself as the successful daughter. The Sterlings spent months assuming they were dealing with a vulnerable family that lacked financial sophistication. Every one of those assumptions had just been challenged. The problem for them was that the truth had only begun to surface. My mother wiped tears from her eyes while staring at the documents projected onto the screen. Why? She asked softly. The question surprised me. Out of everything happening, that was what she wanted to know. Not how, not when, why. I looked at her for a moment before answering. Because you were my family. The room remained silent. My father lowered his eyes. For the first time all evening, he looked ashamed. Not completely, not enough, but more than before. He remembered every criticism, every comparison, every time he dismissed me while praising Jasmine. The documents on the screen had transformed those memories into something much harder to ignore. Jasmine folded her arms tightly. She looked less shocked now and more irritated. The attention had shifted away from her completely. Even worse, the person receiving that attention was me. So what? She finally said. You helped the family once. That doesn't change everything. There it was. The selfishness. the inability to see beyond herself. Several guests glanced toward her in disbelief. Even they recognized how cold the comment sounded. Jasmine either didn't notice or didn't care. Nobody said it changes everything, I replied calmly. But it changes more than you think. Trey stepped forward before Jasmine could continue. His voice carried the confidence of someone desperately trying to regain control. This still has nothing to do with the investment opportunity. A few heads nodded. The statement sounded reasonable on the surface. Trey knew exactly what he was doing. Redirect the conversation. Move people away from uncomfortable facts. Get everyone focused on the future instead of the past. It was a smart move. Unfortunately for him, I had already anticipated it. Actually, I said, it has everything to do with the investment opportunity. The room immediately became attentive again. Trey stiffened. Sterling Reynolds remained silent near the back of the crowd, but I noticed his eyes narrowing slightly. He knew where this was heading now. More importantly, he knew I wasn't bluffing. I opened another file on the tablet. The screen changed. Corporate records appeared. Entity registrations. Property acquisition summaries. Financial relationships. To most people, the information looked complicated. To the professionals in the room, it looked alarming. The investor who had spoken earlier stepped closer again. His expression grew increasingly serious. These entities are connected to Sterling Holdings, he said quietly. Several guests exchanged confused looks. My father frowned. What does that mean? I enlarged one section of the chart. A network of companies appeared. Some were active, others were dormant. Several existed only on paper. Yet all of them eventually led back to the same place. Sterling Holdings. The room grew noticeably quieter. Over the last 3 years, I explained, these companies have acquired distressed assets across multiple counties. Trey immediately interrupted. That's called business. Sometimes, I agreed, when it's done honestly. A ripple moved through the crowd. Trey took a step toward me. What exactly are you accusing us of? His voice was louder now, sharper. The polished image was cracking again. I remained calm. Nothing. The answer surprised him. It surprised everyone. I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm showing documented transactions. Facts are dangerous because they don't need emotion to be effective. Sterling understood that, which was why he finally decided to speak. Nia, he said smoothly, you've clearly spent a great deal of time looking into our company. Yes. Then you know we operate completely within the law. There it was. Not honest, not ethical, not transparent, legal. The distinction mattered. Several professionals in the room noticed it too. The investor folded his arms thoughtfully. An attorney near the rear of the crowd stopped taking notes and simply watched. The atmosphere was changing again. Slowly, relentlessly. Sterling continued. Business success often creates resentment. A few people nodded, particularly from individuals who don't fully understand how these transactions work. Another clever move. Frame me as emotional, frame himself as experienced. Under normal circumstances, it might have worked. The problem was that too many documents were already visible. Facts were beginning to outweigh reputation. I clicked another file open. This one immediately attracted attention. Several debt schedules appeared on the screen. Numbers filled the display. Obligations, liabilities, maturity dates, refinancing events. The investor's expression changed instantly. So did the attorneys. They understood exactly what they were looking at. Trey did too. His face lost color. Only slightly, but enough. My father noticed it. What's wrong? He asked. Nobody answered. The room had become completely focused on the screen. The debt figures weren't catastrophic by themselves. Many companies carry debt. Successful companies carry debt. That wasn't the problem. The problem was the timing, the structure, the concentration of risk. Anyone experienced enough to read the numbers could see the pressure building underneath. Interesting, the investor finally said. The single word carried far more weight than most people realized. Sterling looked toward him immediately. What exactly is interesting? The investor pointed toward several obligations scheduled within the same period. Liquidity pressure. Sterling's smile tightened. Just slightly. Perfectly manageable. Perhaps. The investor didn't sound convinced. Neither did the attorney standing nearby. My father looked increasingly confused. My mother looked frightened again. Jasmine looked annoyed that anyone was discussing spreadsheets instead of her engagement. Meanwhile, Trey was becoming visibly uncomfortable. The room no longer belonged to him. The conversation no longer belonged to him. The narrative no longer belonged to him. Every minute moved the spotlight further away from his carefully constructed image. I looked directly at Sterling. You needed capital. He didn't answer. You needed it quickly. Still no answer. And that's why this house became important. A murmur moved through the crowd. My father slowly turned towards Sterling. For the first time all evening, doubt appeared in his eyes. Real doubt. Dangerous doubt. The kind that once formed cannot easily be removed. Trey immediately stepped in. This is ridiculous. His voice cracked slightly. You're connecting things that have nothing to do with each other. I smiled faintly. Am I? Nobody answered. Because nobody was sure anymore. The certainty that filled the room 2 hours earlier had vanished. In its place stood questions. Questions Sterling could not fully answer. Questions Trey could not silence. Questions my parents had never thought to ask. I looked down at the tablet one final time. The next file waited only a few inches away. The file that would explain why the Sterling family was truly interested in this property. The file that would reveal just how desperate their situation had become. But that revelation could wait a little longer. Because as I lifted my eyes toward Sterling Reynolds, I saw something for the first time that night. Fear. Not much. Just enough. And if Sterling Reynolds was afraid, it meant I was finally getting close to the secret he had spent years trying to protect. The room remained frozen after my final words. Nobody seemed willing to speak first. The atmosphere had changed completely from the celebration that existed less than an hour earlier. There were no smiles now, no laughter, no engagement party. The only thing left was uncertainty. Every guest could feel it. Every guest knew something important was about to happen. The difference was that only a few people understood just how devastating it would be. My father stared at me from across the room. My mother sat motionless in her chair. Jasmine looked increasingly uncomfortable. Trey looked angry. Sterling Reynolds looked cautious. For the first time all evening, he was studying me instead of dismissing me. That alone was worth paying attention to. Men like Sterling only become careful when they recognize a genuine threat. I slowly looked around the room before speaking again. For most of my life, everyone here believed the same story. Nobody interrupted. The story was simple. Jasmine was the successful daughter. I was the failure. My father lowered his eyes. My mother looked away. Several guests shifted awkwardly. They had heard those stories themselves over the years. Some had probably repeated them. I dropped out of college. I nodded. That's true. Jasmine immediately looked relieved. She thought I was admitting defeat. She still didn't understand where this was going. I disappeared from Atlanta. I nodded again. Also true. Trey folded his arms confidently. Beverly's expression relaxed slightly. They thought facts were finally returning to their side. Then I smiled. What nobody ever bothered to ask was what happened after I left. The room became silent again. The question hung in the air. What happened after she left? Most people genuinely didn't know. They had accepted the family narrative years ago and never looked beyond it. Why would they? Failure was a simpler story. Easier to understand, easier to repeat. I turned back toward the screen and opened a completely different file. No debt schedules, no property documents, no legal agreements, just a company website. The change immediately confused several guests. Jasmine frowned. Trey looked irritated. Sterling's eyes narrowed. Unlike everyone else, he recognized the logo instantly. That reaction told me more than words ever could. Apex Citadel Capital, one of the fastest-growing private investment firms in the Southeast. The company had acquired major commercial assets, financed development projects, and built a reputation for aggressive but highly successful investments. Most people in the room had heard the name before. A few had even done business with them. The investor standing near the back visibly straightened when the logo appeared. "Why are we looking at this?" my father asked. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I clicked through several pages. Asset summaries, commercial acquisitions, corporate milestones, community recognition awards, business publications. The screen filled with achievements, Real achievements, not social media success, not engagement announcements, actual results. Jasmine laughed nervously. Okay, what does this have to do with anything? I looked at her. Everything. The smile disappeared from her face. Across the room, Trey suddenly stopped looking confident. His eyes remained fixed on the screen, then on me, then back to the screen. He was beginning to connect the dots. Sterling Reynolds had already connected them. I could see it happening in real time. The man wasn't afraid of property records. He wasn't afraid of trust structures. He was afraid of power. And he was starting to realize exactly who had been standing in front of him all evening. Apex Citadel acquired the debt attached to this house 5 years ago, I said calmly. Several guests immediately looked toward the screen. My mother frowned. My father looked confused again. The investor near the back suddenly seemed very interested. Wait, he said. Are you saying? He stopped before finishing the sentence. He didn't need to. Everyone could feel the answer approaching. Jasmine shook her head. No. The word came out automatically, instinctively, as though rejecting reality might somehow stop it from arriving. No, she repeated. That's impossible. I looked directly at her. Is it? She didn't answer. Trey did. You're lying. The room immediately turned toward him. His reaction was too strong, too emotional, too desperate. He realized the mistake the moment the words left his mouth. Calm people don't panic when they're confident. Sterling looked at his son with visible frustration. Trey had just revealed more than he intended. I clicked one final page open. The corporate leadership section appeared. The screen filled with executive profiles. Several names appeared. Board members, senior partners, department heads. Then the page stopped. Right at the top, CEO and founder. The room became so quiet that I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning system overhead. Nobody moved. Nobody blinked. Nobody spoke. They simply stared. My mother's hand covered her mouth. My father leaned forward in disbelief. Jasmine looked at the screen, then at me, then back at the screen again, over and over. As though repetition might somehow change what she was seeing. The investor whispered something under his breath. One of the attorneys actually laughed in disbelief. Beverly's face turned completely pale. Trey looked like he had been punched. Sterling Reynolds closed his eyes briefly before opening them again. Not because he was shocked, because his worst suspicion had just been confirmed. My photograph sat at the top of the screen beside a simple title: Chief Executive Officer, Founder, Apex Citadel Capital. Nobody in the room seemed capable of processing it. Years of assumptions collapsed instantly. The failure, the disappointment, the daughter who never became anything. The woman Jasmine spent the last hour mocking in front of guests. Gone. All of it gone. My father slowly stood from his chair. No, his voice barely worked. No, this can't be real. I looked at him quietly. It is. My mother began crying openly. Not soft tears, real tears. The kind people cry when an entire version of reality breaks apart in front of them. Jasmine stared at me with a mixture of shock, anger, jealousy, and confusion. She looked like someone watching her reflection disappear. For years, she had built her identity around being better than me. Now she didn't know who she was without that comparison. Trey looked terrified. Not embarrassed, terrified. Because unlike most people in the room, he understood exactly what Apex Citadel was capable of. He understood the size of the company, the resources, the influence, the financial power. More importantly, he understood what it meant if the woman he had spent months underestimating controlled all of it. Then Sterling Reynolds finally spoke. His voice was calm but only barely. Interesting. Several guests looked toward him. He forced a smile. Very impressive. But I could hear the strain beneath every word. So could everyone else. Because for the first time all evening, Sterling Reynolds was no longer speaking to someone he considered beneath him. He was speaking to someone who might be more powerful than he was. The realization terrified him. And the worst part for the Sterling family was that the CEO reveal wasn't the real problem. The real problem was what came next. Because now that everyone finally knew who I was, they were about to learn exactly what I had discovered about them. And unlike the lies they built their reputation on, my evidence was about to destroy everything. Nobody cared about the engagement party anymore. The decorations still hung from the ceiling. The champagne still sat on silver trays. The musicians were still standing near the ballroom entrance, yet the event itself no longer existed. Every guest had forgotten why they originally came. The only thing anyone wanted now was the truth. My photograph remained on the screen beside the Apex Citadel logo while shock continued moving through the room like a wave. Some guests stared at me. Others stared at the screen. A few simply stared at the floor, quietly replaying every conversation they had ever heard about me. For years, my family built a story that explained my absence, my silence, and my success. The problem was that none of it had been true. Jasmine looked like she was struggling to breathe. The woman who spent her entire life comparing herself to me had suddenly lost the comparison. Her greatest advantage had vanished in less than 30 seconds. My father sat back down heavily in his chair. My mother continued wiping tears from her face. Trey looked pale. Beverly looked terrified. Only Sterling Reynolds managed to maintain some degree of composure. That alone explained why he had built a business empire while others followed him. He understood that panic rarely improves a bad situation. Unfortunately for him, logic was no longer enough to save what was coming. "How much of this is true?" my father finally asked. The question almost made me smile. The CEO profile was visible on a screen nearly 10 feet wide. The company website was public. The awards were public. The acquisitions were public. Yet somehow he still hoped there might be another explanation. "All of it," I answered. My father's shoulders sagged slightly. The room fell silent again. Then Jasmine laughed. Not because she found anything funny. Because she was desperate. "Okay," she said. "Fine. You're successful. Congratulations." Her voice trembled despite her efforts to control it. "But none of this changes what we're talking about." There it was. The denial stage. Reality arrives. Then people try negotiating with it. Jasmine wasn't interested in understanding the truth. She wanted the truth to stop hurting. "Actually," I said calmly, "it changes everything." I opened another presentation file. Not legal documents, not contracts. A business intelligence report prepared by my analysts. The screen shifted. Charts appeared briefly before transitioning into a timeline. Acquisition records, debt events, property transfers, company restructures. Much easier to understand than the earlier paperwork. Several guests moved closer. The investor near the back folded his arms and focused entirely on the screen. He already knew something serious was coming. The question was how serious. 6 months ago, I began, Apex Citadel started monitoring Sterling Holdings. Every eye immediately moved towards Sterling Reynolds. For the first time all evening, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. Not afraid yet, just uncomfortable. "Why?" one guest asked. I zoomed into the timeline. Because the numbers stopped making sense. Silence followed. Even Trey remained quiet now. My analysts had spent months examining public filings, debt disclosures, lender activity, and acquisition patterns. At first, nothing looked unusual. Then, small inconsistencies appeared, then larger ones, then patterns. The same patterns that appear when a company begins running out of options. 3 years ago, Sterling Holdings began using short-term debt to cover long-term obligations. The investor's expression darkened immediately. He understood the implication. Most guests did not. Then new debt was used to cover older debt. I clicked forward. Then more debt. Another click. Then even more debt. Nobody interrupted. The room was listening now. Really listening. Because unlike earlier, this wasn't a family dispute anymore. This was a business autopsy. Sterling crossed his arms. "Many companies leverage debt. Healthy companies do," I agreed. "Desperate companies depend on it." Several guests looked toward him again. His jaw tightened slightly. "Tiny reactions tell the truth long before words do," I continued. 18 months ago, two major lenders quietly reduced their exposure. The investor nodded. That detail caught his attention immediately. 1 year ago, Sterling Holdings missed internal growth targets. Another click. 9 months ago, refinancing discussions began. Another click. 6 months ago, liquidity concerns appeared. Another click. 3 months ago, emergency capital became necessary. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. The timeline was telling the story for me. Every step led toward the same conclusion. The company wasn't expanding because it was successful. It was expanding because it was trying to survive. Then came the moment that shattered what remained of the Sterling family's image. I opened the next slide. The room collectively leaned forward. A single number appeared in the center of the screen. $14 million. My mother gasped. My father blinked repeatedly. Jasmine stared at the number as though she couldn't process it. Trey immediately looked toward his father. Sterling never took his eyes off the screen. Current exposure, I said quietly. The investor cursed under his breath. One attorney actually removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. They understood exactly what $14 million meant in this context. The figure wasn't just debt. It was pressure, time, risk, desperation. That's impossible, Jasmine whispered. Nobody answered, because nobody credible could. The data came directly from public records, lender disclosures, and acquisition reports. Facts have a way of surviving denial. Trey finally exploded. This is nonsense. His voice echoed across the room. You're twisting information. Every guest turned toward him. He looked nothing like the confident future husband from earlier. The mask was gone. In its place stood an angry young man watching his future collapse. Am I? I asked calmly. Trey took another step forward. You think you're smarter than everyone else because you got lucky. The room went completely silent. There it was. Jealousy, resentment, panic. Everything he spent months hiding. Lucky? I repeated. Is that what you tell yourself? His face turned red. Beverly immediately moved toward him. Trey, the warning came too late. He had already lost control. Nobody takes people like you seriously, he snapped. You disappeared for years and suddenly think you're important. Several guests visibly winced. The comment landed exactly the way I hoped. Not because it hurt me, because it revealed him. People tell the truth when they're angry. The investor looked disgusted. My mother looked horrified. Even my father seemed embarrassed. Trey realized his mistake almost immediately. But once words leave your mouth, they belong to everyone who heard them. I looked at him quietly. And yet somehow you're standing inside a house I saved while begging for money from a company I built. The silence that followed was devastating. Trey looked like he had been hit. Beverly couldn't speak. Jasmine looked trapped between defending her fiancé and accepting reality. Sterling remained motionless. But something had changed. The calm confidence he carried all evening was gone. Because the room no longer viewed him as a successful businessman. They viewed him as a man carrying $14 million of pressure on his back. And they were about to learn just how far he had gone to escape it. The worst part for Sterling Reynolds wasn't the debt. It wasn't the humiliation. It wasn't even the collapse of his reputation. The worst part was that I hadn't yet shown the evidence linking his financial crisis directly to my family's house. And when that connection appeared on the screen, there would be no way left to explain it away. The silence following my last statement lasted longer than any silence earlier that night. It wasn't the silence of confusion anymore. It was the silence of realization. Guests were no longer trying to determine whether I was telling the truth. They were trying to calculate how much of the Sterling family's public image had been built on deception. That distinction mattered. Doubt creates questions. Realization creates consequences. Trey stood frozen near the center of the room, still recovering from his outburst. Jasmine looked completely lost. Beverly's confidence had evaporated. Even my father, who had spent years defending wealthy people simply because they appeared successful, seemed unable to look away from the screen. Only Sterling Reynolds remained standing perfectly still. But I had spent years negotiating with powerful people. I knew what fear looked like when it wore an expensive suit. Sterling was afraid. He simply hadn't accepted it yet. I clicked to the next section of the presentation. The timeline disappeared. A series of internal transaction summaries appeared instead. Not enough information to overwhelm the room. Just enough to tell a story. Earlier tonight, I said calmly, Mr. Reynolds described this proposed investment as an opportunity. Nobody interrupted. An opportunity suggests mutual benefit. My eyes shifted toward Sterling. This wasn't mutual. Several guests exchanged looks. The investor who had been quietly observing all evening moved closer to the screen again. He already knew where this was heading. Professionals always recognize desperation when they see it. Over the last 4 months, I continued, multiple acquisition strategies were considered by Sterling Holdings. The screen changed. Property targets appeared. Commercial assets, residential assets, development parcels. Several names had been highlighted and later abandoned. Then one asset remained, a single property, my parents' house. My mother's face immediately turned pale. My father looked confused, then worried, then frightened. The emotional progression happened right in front of me. Because for the first time, he wasn't viewing the situation as an investment discussion. He was viewing it as a threat. "No," he said quietly. "No, that's not what this was." Nobody answered him. The screen already had. Sterling finally stepped forward. "You're presenting selective information." His voice remained calm, but the confidence from earlier was gone. Completely gone. "Am I?" I asked. Then I enlarged the acquisition recommendation summary prepared by one of Sterling Holdings' advisors. The room became silent again. Several guests leaned forward. Even Jasmine moved closer. A single sentence sat near the center of the page. "Preferred asset due to existing emotional attachment and reduced resistance probability." My mother covered her mouth. My father stared at the screen in disbelief. He didn't understand every financial term appearing throughout the report, but he understood those words. Emotional attachment, reduced resistance. He understood exactly what they meant. "They chose us because they thought we'd be easy to manipulate," he whispered. Nobody contradicted him, because nobody could. The truth was sitting 12 feet wide on the screen. Trey immediately looked toward his father. "Dad." It was the first time all evening he sounded like a frightened child instead of a confident businessman. Sterling ignored him. His eyes never left me. "Where did you get that?" he asked. The question made several guests laugh quietly, not because it was funny, because it was revealing. Innocent people usually challenge accuracy. Guilty people challenge access. The investor noticed it too. So did the attorney. So did everyone else with enough experience to recognize the difference. I smiled slightly. "That isn't the question you should be asking." Sterling's jaw tightened. Across the room, Beverly finally lost her composure. "This is outrageous," she snapped. "We've welcomed your family into our lives." My mother actually laughed. A small, broken laugh. The sound surprised everyone, including her. For years, she admired Beverly, chased Beverly's approval, tried desperately to be accepted into her social circle. Now she finally understood how foolish she had been. "You weren't helping us," my mother said quietly. "You were hunting us." Beverly immediately looked away. The words hit harder than any accusation I could have made. Jasmine stared at her future mother-in-law with growing horror. The image she had built in her mind was collapsing piece by piece. Then came the moment that truly shattered the room. I opened the next file. Not a debt report, not a property document. An email chain. Short, simple, direct. Several names had been redacted, one had not. Sterling Reynolds. I enlarged a single paragraph. "We need the property secured before lender review. If necessary, use the engagement timeline to accelerate trust development." Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Even the air felt heavier. My father slowly sat down again. My mother looked like she might cry. Jasmine looked physically ill. Trey closed his eyes briefly. The sentence had done what hours of arguments could not. It connected everything. The engagement, the pressure, the timing, the paperwork, the house. Suddenly, none of it looked coincidental anymore. Sterling took a step forward. "That's being taken out of context." The words sounded weak the moment they left his mouth, because everyone in the room knew there was no good context for that sentence. The investor shook his head slowly. The attorney looked disgusted. Several guests began quietly gathering their belongings. Nobody wanted to remain attached to what was becoming a public collapse. Then, something unexpected happened. My father stood up. For the first time all evening, he wasn't looking at me. He wasn't looking at the screen. He was looking directly at Sterling Reynolds. "Did you ever intend to tell us the truth?" The question carried decades of pride, trust, insecurity, and disappointment. Sterling didn't answer immediately. That hesitation told everyone everything. My father lowered his eyes. The man who spent years believing wealthy people deserved admiration had finally discovered that wealth and character are not the same thing. The lesson came at a painful price. Jasmine began crying quietly. Not dramatic tears. Real tears. The kind that arrive when denial finally dies. She looked at Trey. Trey looked at the floor. Neither knew what to say. Their future suddenly looked very different than it had a few hours earlier. Then I delivered the final blow of the evening. Not because I wanted revenge, because the truth deserved completion. The house wasn't the backup plan, I said softly. Every head turned toward me. Even Sterling. It was the last plan. The room went completely silent. The investor frowned. The attorney stopped taking notes. Trey looked terrified. Sterling's face lost its remaining color. Because unlike everyone else, he understood exactly what I meant. The house wasn't one asset among many. It was the asset, the final lifeline, the last remaining path out of disaster. And if that was true, then the real financial situation facing Sterling Holdings was far worse than anyone in the room had imagined. I looked at Sterling Reynolds as the realization spread across his face. Then I turned back toward the screen. Because the evidence proving exactly how desperate he had become was waiting in the next file. And once that truth appeared, there would be no saving what remained of the Sterling family empire. Nobody spoke after my last statement. The house wasn't the backup plan. It was the last plan. The sentence seemed to drain whatever confidence remained inside the Sterling family. Even guests who understood very little about finance recognized the implication immediately. If a wealthy family became desperate enough to target a single residential property, then the situation behind the scenes had to be far worse than anyone imagined. Trey looked toward his father as though waiting for him to deny everything. Sterling never did. For the first time all evening, he appeared genuinely trapped. Every explanation he might have offered was now blocked by evidence. Every excuse had already been weakened by facts. Every attempt to regain control only made him look more guilty. The room had stopped seeing him as a successful businessman. They were beginning to see him as a desperate man protecting a collapsing empire. I turned back toward the screen and opened the final report prepared by my team. Unlike the previous files, this one contained no complicated charts, no corporate structures, no legal analysis. Just a simple timeline. Sometimes the truth becomes more powerful when it is easier to understand. Several guests moved closer. My parents remained seated. Jasmine stood motionless beside Trey. Beverly looked exhausted. Sterling looked defeated. The first entry appeared on the screen. 5 years ago. Mortgage default risk identified. My father immediately lowered his eyes. The date hurt because he remembered it. The second entry appeared. Foreclosure review initiated. My mother began crying quietly again. Then the third entry appeared. Debt acquired by private entity. The room remained silent. Everyone already knew who that entity was. I clicked forward. Property obligations paid in full. Another click. Property transferred into protected trust structure. Another click. Maintenance reserve established. Another click. Annual tax obligations funded. Another click. Capital improvement account created. My father slowly looked back toward the screen. Confusion replaced grief. Then confusion became disbelief. Then disbelief became understanding. The house hadn't merely been saved, it had been maintained, protected, preserved, for years. My mother noticed it at the same moment. The taxes, she whispered. I nodded. Paid. Another tear rolled down her face. The roof repairs? Paid. She covered her mouth. The plumbing work? Paid. Yes. Every answer seemed to make the room quieter. Jasmine stared at me. Not with anger anymore. With shock. Genuine shock. Because she was finally realizing the scale of what had happened. She spent years believing our parents supported me financially. The truth was the complete opposite. For years, I had quietly protected all of them while accepting their criticism in return. Nobody had ever thanked me because nobody knew. The irony would have been funny under different circumstances. My father stood slowly and approached the screen. He looked smaller than he had earlier that evening. Not physically, emotionally. The certainty he carried for decades had disappeared. All this time? He asked quietly. All this time? I nodded once. He stared at the timeline. 5 years of payments, 5 years of protection, 5 years of silence, 5 years during which he continued telling everyone that Jasmine was the daughter who would save the family. My father closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, they looked older, much older. Why didn't you tell us? The question came from pain, not accusation. I thought about the answer for several seconds. Then I told him the truth. Because I didn't do it for recognition. The room fell silent again. Nobody knew how to respond to that. Beverly looked away. Trey looked at the floor. Jasmine wiped tears from her face. My mother sat down heavily in a nearby chair. Years of assumptions were collapsing around her. She spent so much time chasing approval from people like Beverly that she never stopped to appreciate the daughter quietly protecting her life. Then came the final document, the one I had waited all night to reveal. Not because it would destroy Sterling Reynolds, because it would finally tell the complete story. I opened the trust registration record and enlarged a single section. Beneficiary designation. Several guests leaned closer. My father frowned. My mother looked confused. Then she saw it. So did my father. So did Jasmine. Their reactions happened almost simultaneously. Complete shock. Not because the trust belonged to me. They already knew that. The shock came from who the trust protected. My parents. Both of them. Lifetime occupancy rights. Full residential protection. Guaranteed housing security. Their names appeared clearly within the trust structure. The room became completely silent. Even Sterling looked surprised. My father read the section twice, then a third time. My mother started crying openly. Not from sadness, from guilt. They finally understood. The trust had never been built to control them. It had been built to protect them. Even after years of criticism, even after years of rejection, even after years of being treated like the family disappointment, I still made sure they would never lose their home. My father looked at me with tears forming in his eyes. You protected us. It wasn't a question. It was a realization. A painful one. I nodded slowly. Across the room, Jasmine began crying harder. The image she built around herself was gone now. She wasn't the daughter who saved the family. She never had been. The daughter she mocked, ignored, and underestimated had been carrying the burden alone for years. Beverly looked deeply uncomfortable. For perhaps the first time in her life, wealth could not buy her way out of shame. Trey looked completely broken. Sterling Reynolds simply stood in silence. His empire was finished. His reputation was finished. His plan was finished. Yet somehow none of those things felt like the most important part of the evening anymore. The real story had become something else. Family. Regret. Lost years. My father slowly walked toward me. Every guest watched. Every guest understood this moment mattered more than all the financial revelations combined. He stopped only a few feet away. Tears filled his eyes. I was wrong. The words barely escaped his mouth. For a man like my father, that confession cost more than money ever could. My mother covered her face and cried. Jasmine looked completely shattered. The room remained silent. Then I looked around one final time. At the guests, at the Sterlings, at my family, at the house that almost disappeared 5 years earlier. Everything had finally been exposed. Every lie, every manipulation, every assumption. The truth stood in full view now. The only thing left was deciding what happened next. And as I looked at the people who had spent years defining my value without ever knowing my worth, I realized the hardest decision of the entire night still hadn't been made. Forgiveness. For a long moment after my father admitted he was wrong, nobody in the room moved. The house was silent except for the sound of my mother's quiet sobbing. Less than 3 hours earlier, everyone had gathered to celebrate Jasmine's future. Now the engagement party had become something entirely different. It had become a reckoning. Every lie had been exposed. Every assumption had been challenged. Every person in the room had been forced to confront the difference between appearance and reality. My father stood only a few feet away from me. The strongest emotion on his face wasn't shame. It was regret. Years of regret. Regret for every time he compared me to Jasmine. Regret for every time he dismissed my choices. Regret for every time he assumed silence meant failure. I could see it in his eyes. The painful realization that he had spent more than a decade misunderstanding his own daughter. My mother finally lowered her hands from her face. Tears continued running down her cheeks. "We didn't know," she whispered. The words broke something inside the room. Because they were true. They genuinely didn't know. They didn't know who I had become. They didn't know what I had built. They didn't know who protected them when they were at their weakest. Most importantly, they never cared enough to ask. No, I said softly. You didn't. My father looked down at the floor. My mother began crying again. Neither tried defending themselves. Neither argued. For once, excuses had disappeared. Across the room, Jasmine sat alone in a chair, staring at nothing. The confident woman who spent the evening mocking me was gone. In her place sat someone confronting a truth she never expected to face. Her entire identity had been built around being the successful daughter, the admired daughter, the chosen daughter. Now she understood something painful. Being loved more did not mean she had contributed more. Being praised more did not mean she had sacrificed more. She looked up at me with red eyes. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked. The question sounded almost identical to my father's earlier question, yet it carried a completely different meaning. Jasmine wasn't asking about the trust. She was asking about my success, about Apex Citadel, about everything. I thought about the answer for several seconds, because none of you wanted to hear it. The room became silent again. Jasmine looked away first. Deep down, she knew I was right. Every time I tried sharing a small achievement over the years, somebody compared it to her. Every time I accomplished something, somebody minimized it. Eventually, I stopped trying. Not because I was hiding, because I was tired. Across the room, Beverly slowly gathered her purse. The woman who entered the house believing she controlled every conversation now looked desperate to leave. Nobody stopped her. Nobody cared. Her influence had evaporated. Several guests were already leaving quietly. Others remained only because they couldn't look away from the collapse. Sterling Reynolds still hadn't moved. He stood near the back of the room watching everything unravel around him. The investors were gone. The opportunities were gone. The reputation he spent decades building had been severely damaged, yet he looked less concerned about himself than he did about his son. Trey sat silently beside Jasmine with his head lowered. Earlier that evening, he looked like a future business star. Now he looked like a man realizing his future had just changed forever. Eventually, Sterling approached me. The room immediately became tense again. Not because people expected another fight, because they understood this would likely be the final conversation between us. Sterling stopped several feet away and studied me carefully. "You've won," he said quietly. The statement surprised me, not because it was generous, because it was honest. I shook my head. "This was never about winning." Sterling gave a tired smile. "That's the difference between us." For the first time all evening, there was no manipulation in his voice, no performance, no strategy. Just exhaustion. He looked toward my parents, then toward the trust documents still displayed on the screen. Finally, he nodded once. "Take care of them." Then he turned and walked away. Beverly followed immediately. Trey hesitated longer. Jasmine looked at him. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Trey stood and followed his parents out the door. The engagement ring remained on Jasmine's finger, but everyone in the room understood what had happened. Some relationships survive pressure, others reveal what they truly are. This one had revealed enough. As the front door closed behind the Sterlings, the house felt different. Lighter somehow. The performance was over. The pretending was over. The chasing approval was over. My father slowly approached me again. This time there were no speeches prepared. No dramatic apologies, just honesty. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said quietly, "but I am sorry." My mother nodded through her tears. "So am I." I believed them. That was the strange part. For years I imagined this moment differently. I imagined anger, vindication, satisfaction. Instead, I felt tired. Not because I hated them, because carrying disappointment for so long is exhausting. I looked around the room that almost became someone else's house 5 years earlier. The same room where birthdays had been celebrated, holidays shared, arguments fought, memories created. So much time had been lost inside these walls. Time nobody could get back. "I can't change the past," my father said. "I know, but I would like a chance to do better." The room grew quiet. This was the moment. The decision I had been avoiding all evening. Not whether the Sterlings deserved consequences. They already received them. Not whether the truth should be revealed. It already had been. The real question was whether I wanted to continue carrying the weight of old wounds. I took a slow breath. "Trust takes time." My father nodded immediately. I understand. My mother reached for his hand. Neither looked relieved. Neither expected instant reconciliation. That mattered. Growth begins when people stop demanding forgiveness and start earning it. I glanced toward Jasmine. She remained seated across the room, lost in thought. Eventually, she stood and walked toward me. The confidence she carried all evening was gone. "I'm sorry, too," she whispered. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I nodded. Not because everything was fixed, because healing has to begin somewhere. The future would decide the rest. An hour later, most guests had gone home. The musicians had packed their equipment. The decorations remained, but the celebration had ended. I stepped outside onto the front porch alone. The night air felt cool against my skin. Behind me stood the house I had protected for 5 years. Ahead of me stretched a future nobody in my family had imagined. My phone buzzed. A message from one of my executives appeared on the screen. A simple question about a meeting scheduled for Monday morning. I smiled. Life was moving forward. As I looked out across the dark Atlanta street, I realized something important. Success had never been the money. It wasn't the company. It wasn't the power. Real success was standing there without needing anyone's approval. For years, people defined my value based on what they could see: my degree, my job, my social status, my silence. They were all wrong. Value doesn't come from recognition, it comes from character, from resilience, from the decisions you make when nobody is watching. The people who underestimated me spent years believing they were writing my story. The truth was much simpler. They were only reading the first chapter, and by the time they finally understood who I was, I had already become someone they never imagined possible.